Why would a mom who loved her children, why would she do something like this?
Tragedy strikes on the East Coast when two young sisters are found murdered in their own home. Investigators now say the person responsible for the double murder was actually the one who was supposed to protect the girls.
It's unusual for a mom in particular to kill her children in that way.
There's still a lot of unanswered questions, namely why were the two young girls killed? But what we do know comes from law enforcement in Maine. All this happened in Mechanic Falls, about 40 minutes north of Portland. First responders were called to a home there on Saturday, July 27th, after getting a call about a stolen U-Haul. It had been rented by 37-year-old Jennifer Barney, but was never returned. When officials arrived at her home, they found the bodies of Barney's two daughters, 11-year-old Harmony West and 7-year-old Hope West. Their bodies were found the same day Hope was set to celebrate her birthday. Neighbors later told law enforcement the girls usually played outside together on the trampoline, but no one had seen them in weeks. Officials are keeping details of the girls' murders close to the vest, but we do know one of the girls had multiple stab wounds, and that was the cause of her death. The other died of multiple injuries, but we're still not sure which girl died of what cause. To make sense of the case as we know it right now, we reached out to forensic psychologist Dr. Joni Johnston.
Well, I have to tell you, even though I've been a practicing psychologist for so long, I always respond to these cases first and foremost as a mom. And I just was absolutely heartbreaking to think of these, 7-year-old and 11-year-old children who are now, won't have the chance to grow up and do all the things that we've had the opportunity to do. And of course, the second question is always why? Why would a mom who loved her children, and I think she clearly did love her children, why would she do something like this?
You were talking about red flags or clues that might have indicated this was around the corner for this mom and her two young daughters. Do you think that's something that, looking back in retrospect, her family or friends could point to something and say, okay, I think this could have been off?
I think what we are likely to hear about. I mean, there's a couple of things or questions that come to mind for me that would help answer that question. One being, how involved was she in her community? What kind of a support system did she have? Because that oftentimes, I think, is something that we see preceding that. Either they are isolated geographically from their support system, or because they're experiencing mental health issues, they withdraw. And so sometimes people will say, I had no idea because I haven't seen this person, or I've talked to them on the phone, but they haven't been available, or I've noticed that they just weren't as outgoing. And so that in and of itself can certainly be a cause for concern. Of course, not an indicator that somebody's going to be murdered, but it can be an indication of depression.
When it comes to mothers murdering their children, some major names come up, like Susan Smith or Andrea Yates. The Yates case gained national attention in 2001 when the stay-at-home mom killed all 5 of her children by drowning them in the bathtub. In 2002, Yates was tried and found guilty of capital murder. She was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 40 years, but shortly after that, Yates's verdict was appealed. She was retried in 2006 and found not guilty by reason of insanity. Her case has since become synonymous with postpartum psychosis. And this is a topic that we talk about, unfortunately, a couple times a year at least on Law and Crime, where we have a mother who kills her 2 young children. Most recently, we were talking about postpartum psychosis and a case that went along with that. But in this instance, the 2 girls were ages 11 and 7. So it gets me thinking it's probably not related to postpartum psychosis because it's been almost a decade since she last gave birth. What do you think?
Yeah, I agree with you. There's certainly no indication. And I can't even imagine, postpartum mood disorder, for example, extended for 7 years. It's relatively rare, though, for a mom to be killing her children. But by the vast majority of the time, it is an intimate partner domestic violence situation, and the intimate partner homicide is an extension of that. So it's relatively unusual to have this happen. When we do see, though, moms who, kill their children, we most likely see a history of either depression or psychosis, a history of social isolation. Sometimes you see a history of substance abuse that's in the mix. None of these, again, in of themselves mean that we could predict murder murder or suicide, but they are things that are concerning.
Johnston says from the offset, it seems like Barney may have struggled with her mental health, and without the proper help, that can be a recipe for disaster.
And part of that untreated depression can manifest itself as distorted thinking. Anybody who's been depressed knows that it's just the world becomes clouded. When somebody's not has untreated depression, and what can happen, particularly if a single parent is struggling, is the thinking becomes along the lines of, I can't take care of my children anymore. There's nobody else to take care of my child. My child couldn't live without me. So it's better for them if I take them with me. So it's almost like the murder part of it becomes an extension of a suicide of a parent. And in their distorted thinking,
Johnston says generally, and potentially even in Barney's case, some sort of outside stressor could trigger the person struggling with their mental health.
but in that person's mind at that point, because they're depressed and because that depression isn't being treated, and perhaps there are other stressors, oftentimes we'll see a stressor. I know that I've read that there was, she rented a U-Haul and there had been a past due rent notice on her door. So that makes me question whether she was having some serious financial problems, which is not unusual for that to be a precipitant, where you have all this stuff going on. You have a parent who's struggling, limited support, and then things pile up, and that thinking becomes dangerous, because what's happening is our normal love and care for our child becomes distorted. And we start thinking that taking that child's life is, in some respects, a perverse way of loving that child. When if that parent had gotten treatment and gotten help, they would clearly understand that that's not a reflection of love. And at that point, this person is kind of viewing her children more as an extension of herself, as opposed to, separate beings.
Beyond the mental health aspects of the case, the nature of the crime is uniquely shocking. If we're just looking at the crime face value, I mean, murder is the most severe crime that you can commit. We cover it a lot here on Law and Crime. But what takes it to the next level here is, first of all, that the victims are children, but additionally, it's someone in their own family who killed them. So a lot of the time we cover a girlfriend or a boyfriend or even a stranger at times, but this is so intimate between a mother and a child. Do you think that makes any difference in the case?
I think it certainly makes a difference. It would have made a huge difference if the children had survived, for example, because I think that would feel so confusing to a child who survives an attempted murder suicide. And children, think they know their parents love them. They love their parents, and so it's unfathomable to them that they're betrayed in this way. And it really is the ultimate betrayal. And it certainly, I think, impacts the way we as society view this, because I think for many of us, there are few things that seem more horrendous than a parent taking the life of their children.
In terms of how the girls were killed, we still only know that one of them died by stab wounds and the other of multiple injuries. Does it matter how they were killed as in relation to trying to figure out what was going on in their mom's mind?
The only thing, it's unusual for a mom in particular to kill her children in that way. They're more likely to smother, for example. They're more likely to overdose them or give them some kind of drug and kind of put them to sleep in a way. So we tend to see moms who use less violent means. So it does raise, I think, some questions in terms of, is there a history of abuse, for example, in this family where she's lost her temper? Did something happen where she got so frustrated, so overwhelmed, so angry, whatever, that she hurts one of the children? Maybe she kills one of the children and then can't face this. So it does make me wonder what was going on in this house around the time that this happened, because it is very unusual to see a mom who decides to either stab a child to death or beat a child to death. We don't know. I don't know what they mean exactly by these other injuries, but it certainly sounds like there was a lot of physical contact. And so it does raise some concern for me about those kinds of questions.
The questions continue when it comes to Barney's death. Investigators say she died by suicide, but we're not sure how exactly.
It would be interesting to know that, does she stab herself in response to all this, which would, I think, really kind of speak more to an impulsive decision to just, she stabbed her children and now she's stabbing herself? Does she, what amount of time elapsed between her children's death and her death? They weren't found for a number of days, it sounds like. And so I think that would provide some important information. And yeah, I think it would make a difference whether she overdosed on something after killing her children in a more violent way or if she did it right away. There are a lot of unanswered questions in this case.
Do you think that some of those unanswered questions could possibly have answers if investigators are going through, let's say she kept a journal, or if they look at her texts or past social media interactions to maybe get a look inside the mother's mind, how she was feeling around the time of these murders?
I think it would be important, and I'm certainly sure they're doing that, really investigate it, because the best way to prevent these things from happening in the future is understanding the way people are thinking around this time. So looking at diaries or journals, looking at electronic media, phone calls, text, those kinds of things, looking at any mental health history that she might have. Does she have a history of suicide attempts? If so, what were they? What were the circumstances leading up to those suicide attempts? What stressors was she experiencing in her life? I mean, was she moving? Did she have some serious financial problems? Did she talk to anybody about it? What did she say? Sometimes people will give hints about, I just can't take this anymore, or things are just becoming too much. It's very rare for a murder suicide to happen without there being any clues or some kind of hints that are given. Now, I'm not saying that, people should have a crystal ball or some kind of sixth sense and know that how to interpret things that people say, but people do often leave clues that things are becoming too much and they're thinking darkly.
But murder suicide itself is relatively rare.
When we look at the murder suicide literature, we discover a couple of different things. One is murder suicide occurs in about 11 times every week. So there are about 11 murder suicides that happen every single week, which accounts for about 1,000 to 1,500 deaths a year. So it's about 5% of total suicides. It's relatively rare, though.
From here, the case is still under investigation and has been turned over to the Maine State Police Major Crimes Unit. When talking about the investigation, you mentioned that it's really important to gather information so that we can prevent this in the future. How are we going to learn more about this type of incident if we don't have the information here to prevent it in the future? So let's say they're gathering all of this data from this specific case. How is that something that could help in the future prevent situations like this?
Well, I think what we can learn, one of the things we do is we look in the research, we look for what those risk factors are. So in other words, studying 1,000 people who have committed homicide after a suicide, we look at all the things. We look at what's the age of the person, what's the gender of the person, what's the early life history of that person, because there's always multiple places to intervene. What is this person's stress level like? What are this person's coping mechanisms like? What is their family history of dealing with problems? Are they an internalizer or more of an externalizer? We look at, again, what things do people do? What do they say leading up to this? There have been plenty of people who have survived, who've committed a murder and attempted suicide, and they have survived that attempt. And they are often very valuable sources of information about what they were thinking at that time. And then that information, what we can do as mental health professionals, but also as friends and concerned family members, is we can pay attention. When I see these behavior changes, when I see this person saying things that are unusual or talking about, life isn't worth it anymore, or I just feel like checking out, or I can't handle these kids anymore. I wish somebody would just take them. I mean, those are things I think that sometimes people respond in a judgmental way. Like, how can you talk like that? These are your kids. That person may be, that may be a cry for help for this person. So we can, learn to respond differently, recognize and then respond differently to these things that we know are certainly, risky in terms of that person's mental health, and worst case scenario can be a risk for violence.
And we talked about the investigation, what we assume detectives are combing through now, whether it be journals, texts, phone logs, things like that. But do you have any other idea of what they would be looking for in the investigation?
Well, I think they will also be looking to put together some kind of a timeline. And I think that will be very informative, as I was mentioning a minute ago, looking at Again, the precipitants that were happening, the circumstances surrounding the U-Haul, for example. When was that rented and why was that rented? Talking to as many family members as they can. They'll be doing in a way kind of almost like a psychological autopsy, probably on the mom, to kind of get a sense of what was her life like in the 2 weeks leading up to this event, to see what kind of information they can gather. So it'll be a lot of information, I think, about what happened at the crime scene, but even as important is what led up to this. And talking to people who are around them, talking to the school. What were the girls saying? Did the girls to talk to their friends? Did they talk to their teachers? Were they worried about anything? Did anybody notice a change in the girls? Did Harmony, who was 11, did she keep a diary? So there's all that information, I think, that they can gather to put together, as much as possible, a picture of what this family's life was like in the month or so leading up to their deaths.
Meanwhile, Johnston reminds us that depression affects a lot of people, and there are ways to get help. If someone's watching this and seeing a loved one who's going through something like this, who has yet to receive any sort of treatment, how do you approach that sort of subject?
I think you approach it in a couple of different ways. One is you express concern for that person. I'm concerned about you. I'm worried about you. And then I think it can be helpful just to point out some specific behaviors that you've observed or some changes in behavior. And if you're concerned that this person may be thinking about suicide, it's important to ask that directly. I think there's still a lot of concern that if I bring this up, I'm planting a seed in somebody's mind, and that in fact is not the case. And it's interesting because one of the things we've learned as therapists in the past, I think 5 to 10 years, is that we as therapists, if somebody comes to us and they are depressed or they're talking about suicide, we also have to assess their risk for hurting other people. And traditionally, we were always taught when I was in school that, they're opposites. If somebody is suicidal, they're never going to be homicidal. If they're homicidal, they're not going to be suicidal. We either internalize things or we externalize things. And we now know that's not true at all. And that we need to be, not to have the courage to ask about those things. And the same can be true, with a friend that we're concerned about. If we're seeing our friend who is struggling or incredibly short-tempered with their children, we can talk about the fact that it just seems like this is a lot for you right now. How can I help you with the kids? What kind of support can I give you? And those kinds of things. And then help that person get the help that they need.
As we come to terms with the tragic case, Johnston says there are still things to keep in mind.
One of the biggest takeaways when we come across cases like this is to realize that, trying to understand something is not making an excuse for it. And it's very easy, I think, in a situation like this to judge this mom. And she is 100% responsible for taking the life of her children. Nothing excuses that. But if we get stuck there, if we just stay there, then we deprive ourselves of the opportunity to gather more information and prevent the next mom from acting on her depression or thoughts or whatever's going on in her mind.
Right now, the murders are still under investigation. Anyone with more information is asked to contact the Maine State Police. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Gillespie.